The Clockmaker's Secret, a tale of time, choices, and redemption. Introduction. Whitestone was the kind of town that seemed frozen in time, tucked away in a valley surrounded by dense woods. Its cobblestone streets and weathered buildings bore the weight of centuries. The townsfolk often joked that time moved differently in Whitestone. Some days felt like years, while years seemed to pass in the blink of an eye. But there was one man who seemed to understand the mystery of time better than anyone else. Elias Grayson, the enigmatic clockmaker. For decades, Elias had lived on the outskirts of town, crafting intricate clocks that were as much art as they were engineered marvels. His shop, Grayson's Timepieces, was filled with creations that seemingly defied logic. Clocks that whispered instead of ticked, timepieces that glowed in the dark, and mechanisms so precise they could predict the phases of the moon. For most of the town, Elias was a curiosity. He rarely spoke, never attended festivals, and lived a life of solitude. But when Elias Grayson disappeared without a trace, Whitestone's quiet rhythm was disrupted. Detective Clara Hayes had grown up in Whitestone, but left years ago to escape its suffocating predictability. She had built a life for herself in the city, chasing ambition and solving high-profile cases. But when she received a call about Elias's disappearance, something in her stirred. Perhaps it was nostalgia, or maybe it was curiosity. But Clara found herself driving back to the town she had long left behind. As she parked the car outside the clockmaker's shop, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this would be no ordinary case. The air was thick with anticipation, and the faint ticking of unseen clocks seemed to echo in the stillness. She pushed open the door, stepping into a world where time itself seemed to hold its breath. Chapter 1. The Disappearance. The interior of Grayson's timepiece was like stepping into another era. Clocks of every size and design covered the walls, their hands moving in a symphony of mismatched rhythms. Some ticked loudly, others barely whispered, and a few seemed to move backward. The air smelled of varnished wood, metal, and something faintly sweet, like old books and forgotten memories. Claire's eyes scanned the room. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture or broken glass. It was as if Elias had simply vanished, leaving everything perfectly in place. She approached the counter and noticed a ledger open to the last entry. Final adjustments complete. The clock is ready. Her brow furrowed. What clock? Behind the counter was a door that led to the workshop. Clara pushed it open and stepped into a space filled with tools, gears, and half-finished clocks. The workbench was cluttered but organized, each tool meticulously placed. A journal lay open, its pages filled with intricate diagrams and handwritten notes. One sketch caught her attention, a clock unlike any she had ever seen. Its face was divided into concentric circles, each inscribed with symbols and patterns. Beneath the sketch, Elias had written, "Time is a web, not a line. Every choice creates a ripple." Clara's curiosity deepened. She flipped through the journal, finding more musings. What if we could see the paths not taken? The clock is the key. It shows us what could be. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a rhythmic tapping, almost like the ticking of a clock, but deeper and slower. It seemed to be coming from behind a large cabinet. Clara hesitated for a moment before moving the cabinet aside. Behind it was a hidden door, its handle shaped like a coiled serpent. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Her fingers brushed against something tucked in the frame, a small, ornate key. The key fit perfectly, With a soft click, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. Clara's pulse quickened as she descended. The air grew cooler, and the ticking sound grew louder, reverberating through the walls. At the bottom of the stairs was a heavy wooden door. She pushed it open and stepped into a room that took her breath away. The walls were covered in clocks, but these were unlike any she had seen upstairs. Their designs were otherworldly, some with glowing faces, others with hands that moved in strange fluid motions. In the center of the room stood a massive clock on a pedestal. Its face was divided into concentric circles, just like the sketch in Elias' journal. Engraved on the pedestal were the words, "The clock of choices. Time reveals all." Clara reached out, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the clock. Instantly, the room seemed to dissolve around her. Chapter 2. The Workshop of Wonders. As the room dissolved around her, Clara felt a strange sensation, as if she were floating between moments in time. Colors swirled, shadows stretched, and her sense of reality warped. Then, with a sudden jolt, she found herself standing in a small cottage. It was familiar yet distant, like a memory she couldn't quite grasp. The ticking sound was gone, replaced by the soft hum of a fire in the hearth. Clara looked around and saw a younger version of herself sitting at a wooden table, scribbling ferociously in a notebook. The girl's face was youthful but strained, her brow furrowed with determination. It was Clara as a teenager. She recognized the scene immediately. It was the night she had decided to leave Whitestone. Her father, a stern and stubborn man, had been pushing her to take over the family's struggling hardware store. But Clara had dreams of becoming a detective, dreams her father dismissed as childish. The younger Clara paused her writing as her father's voice echoed from another room. "You're wasting your time with those fantasies, Clara. Real life doesn't care about dreams." The words hit her like a blow to the chest, just as they had all those years ago. Clara remembered how she had packed her bags that night, leaving a note on the table before slipping into the dark. But now, as she watched the scene unfold, something shifted. The older Clara noticed a detail she had missed back then. A photo tucked in a corner of the table. It was of her and her father, smiling, arms slung around each other after fixing the store's old cash register. The younger Clara hesitated, her hand hovering over the notebook. For a brief moment, it seemed like she might reconsider, but then her face hardened, and she resumed writing the note. The scene blurred again, and Clara was pulled into another moment. This time, she was standing in the hardware store years later. Her father was older now, his hair grayer, his posture stooped. He stood alone behind the counter, staring out at the window. The rain poured outside. Clara's heart ached. She had never thought about what her leaving might have done to him. She had always framed her decision as the right one for her future, but seeing him now, she realized there was a consequence she had never considered. The clock's faint ticking returned, pulling her attention back to the present. The scene dissolved, and Clara found herself back in the hidden room, standing before the massive clock. She staggered backward, her breath shallow. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You saw the truth," a voice said behind her. Clara spun around to see a man standing in the doorway. His face was weathered but kind, his eyes sharp and piercing. He wore a simple vest and trousers, and his hands were stained with oil and grease. "Elias Grayson?" Clara said, her voice firm. The man nodded. "I see you found my greatest creation." "What is this?" Clara gestured to the clock. "What did you make here?" Elias stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the clock. "This is no ordinary timepiece. It's a window into the choices we make, in the paths we don't take. Every decision we make creates a ripple, a branch in the web of time. This clock allows us to see those branches, to understand the consequences of our actions. Clara frowned. Why would you make something like this? Do you realize what it does to people? Elias sighed, his shoulders slumping. I created it to help people, to give them clarity, to show them how their choices shape their lives. But I underestimated its power. Some who use it become consumed, unable to move forward because they're too focused on what might have been. Others see things they cannot bear to face. Clara's mind raced. And what about you? Why did you disappear? Elias hesitated, then said, I disappeared because I couldn't bear the weight of my own choices. The clock showed me paths I didn't take, lives I could have lived, people I could have helped. They became too much. Clara stared at the clock, its hands moving in strange, fluid motions. She thought, what about what she had seen? Her younger self, her father, the pain she had caused without even realizing it. Why show me that? She asked. Why now? Elias stepped forward, his voice soft. Because you're standing at a crossroads, Clara. You may not realize it, but the choices you make now will shape not just your life, but the lives of others. The clock chose you because you needed to see the bigger picture. Clara felt a lump in her throat. And what if I don't want to see it? What if I just want to live my life without worrying about what could have been? Elias placed a hand on her shoulder. That's a choice only you can make. But remember this, the past cannot be changed, and the future is not set. All we have is the present, and the courage to make the best choices we can. The room fell silent, the ticking on the clock slowing to a steady, rhythmic beat. Clara looked at Elias, then back at the clock. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her choices and the power they held. Chapter 3. The Clock of Choices. Clara's heart raced as Elias' words echoed in her mind. The past cannot be changed, and the future is not set. All we have is the present, and the courage to make the best choices we can. Her eyes remained fixed on the intricate clock in the center of the room. Its concentric circles spun slowly, each marked with symbols she couldn't decipher. The faint ticking now seemed louder, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat pulling her in. Elias stepped back, giving her space. The clock doesn't show you what to do. It only reveals the possibilities. Paths you may take, or paths you're left behind. It's up to you to decide how to use it. Clara swallowed hard, not sure whether to trust him or the clock. Her mind was flooded with questions. Why had Elias built this? Why had it chosen her? But one question overpowered the rest. What happens if I turn the dial? I need to see more, Clara said, almost to herself. Elias tilted his head. Are you sure? Once you peer deeper into the web, it's hard to forget what you've seen. She ignored his warning and reached for the brass dial on the clock's base. It was cool to the touch, engraved with a spiral pattern that seemed to twist endlessly. Taking a deep breath, Clara turned it to the right. The room shifted instantly. The air grew heavier, the light dimmer. Clara felt herself being pulled into another moment, as though the clock had taken a hold of her mind and was leading her somewhere she needed to go. Clara blinked and found herself standing in a bustling city street. The sound of honking cars and hurried footsteps filled her ears. She looked down and realized she was dressed differently, sleek, professional attire that screamed success. A billboard loomed above her, displacing her face with the bold caption, Clara Hayes, CEO of Visionary Technologies. Her heart skipped a beat. She had dreamed of this once, a career that put her name in the lights, a life filled with recognition and achievement. She stepped forward, and the scene shifted slightly. Now she was inside a luxurious office, its glass walls overlooking the city skyline. A younger colleague entered, holding a tablet. "Miss Hayes, the investors are ready for your presentation." Clara nodded, the words feeling foreign yet familiar. As she walked to the conference room, a wave of pride washed over her. She had built this. The vision, the success. It was all hers. But then, as she sat at the head of the table, a hollow ache began to settle in her chest. She glanced around the room at the faces staring back at her, all eager for her next big idea. Something was missing. Before she could identify the source of her unease, the scene dissolved. The air around her grew colder as a new scene unfolded. Claire was in a cozy suburban home, the smell of fresh-baked cookies wafting from the kitchen. Laughter echoed from the living room, where two children played on the floor. She followed the sound and saw herself, older, sitting on the couch beside a man whose face she didn't recognize. They exchanged smiles, their hands intertwined as they watched the children build a tower of blocks. Clara's heart ached. She had never thought much about family, always prioritizing her career over personal relationships. But here, in this life, she saw a version of herself she had never dared to imagine. Content, grounded, surrounded by love. Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped closer, wanting to reach out, to feel the warmth of this life. But just as she extended her hand, the scene began to fade. The ticking returned, sharp and relentless, as Claire found herself back in the clock room. Her breathing was shallow, her hands trembling. She turned to Elias, who stood silently, his expression unreadable. "What? What was that?" she demanded. "Why did you show me those lives? I don't understand." Elias sighed deeply. "The clock reveals the intersections of your choices. Each path you saw was a reflection of decisions you could make, or could have made. One path was driven by ambition, the other by connection. Both are possible, but neither is guaranteed." Claire felt a wave of frustration. But how am I supposed to choose? What if I make the wrong decision? What if I end up regretting everything? Elias stepped closer, his voice gentle. "That's the burden of free will, Claire. There's no such thing as a perfect choice. Every path comes with sacrifices. The question isn't which path is right. It's which path aligns with who we truly are." Clara fell silent, her mind racing. She thought about the successful version of herself, admired by many but seemingly isolated. Then she remembered the warmth of the family scene, the joy of connection. Both lives seemed fulfilling in their own way, but both required sacrifices she wasn't sure she was ready to make. As she stood there, torn between the possibilities, Elias offered her a faint smile. "The clock doesn't control your destiny, Clara. It's a mirror, showing you what's already within you. The choice is always yours." Clara stared at the clock, its concentric circles spinning slowly. For the first time, she understood the weight of her choices. Not just the ones she would make in the future, but the ones she had already made. Taking a deep breath, she turned to Elias. "How do I know if I'm making the right decision?" Elias's eyes softened. "You don't. But if you choose with honesty, courage, and intention, you'll always find your way." The room fell silent, save for the steady ticking of the clock. Clara closed her eyes, the weight of the moment settling over her, and then she turned the dial once more. Chapter 4. The Truth Unveiled. As Clara turned the dial once more, the ticking grew louder, sharper. The room blurred, and she felt herself being pulled into a vortex of light and sound. When the spinning stopped, she was standing in an unfamiliar place, a dimly lit room, walls lined with mirrors. Each mirror reflected a different version of her life. In one, she was delivering a speech to thousands, her name emblazoned on banners behind her. In another, she was surrounded by children, their laughter filling the air. In yet another, she stood alone on a mountain peak, gazing out at the horizon with a look of serenity. Claire's reflection stepped forward from one of the mirrors, her expression calm but piercing. "Do you see it now?" the reflection asked. Claire hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" "The truth," the reflection replied. "That every version of you is shaped by the choices you make, and every choice carries a cost." The mirror shifted, showing scenes of Claire's past, the day she decided to leave her father, the cases she had solved as a detective, the moment she had let relationships slip away in pursuit of her career. "Why are you showing me this?" Claire demanded. "To remind you," the reflection said, "that regret is a shadow cast by indecision. You cannot walk every path. You must choose." The room faded again, and Claire found herself back in the clockmaker's workshop. Elias stood in the corner, watching her with solemn expression. "You saw the mirrors, didn't you?" he asked. Claire nodded. "They showed me everything, my choices, my regrets, the lives I could have lived. I don't know if I can handle it." Elias stepped forward, his voice steady but kind. "That's the burden of the clock. It doesn't just show you the possibilities, it forces you to confront yourself. The real question is, what will you do with what you've seen?" Clara looked at the clock again, its intricate face spinning slowly. "I spent my whole life chasing answers," she said, "solving mysteries, uncovering the truth, but now I feel more lost than ever." Elias gestured to the clock. "Sometimes the greatest mystery isn't out there, it's within you. The clock doesn't give you answers, Clara. It gives you perspective." She turned to him, her frustration boiling over. "But how am I supposed to know what's right? What if I make the wrong choice?" Elias's expression softened. "There is no right or wrong choice. There's only the choice that feels true to you. The clock shows you the paths, but doesn't walk them for you. That's your journey to take." Clara fell silent, the weight of Elias' words settling over her. She thought about everything she had seen, the successes, the sacrifices, the moments of joy and pain. Every path was different, but none were perfect. "Why did you build this clock?" she asked suddenly. Elias hesitated, then said, "I built it because I was afraid of making the wrong choices or wasting my life. I thought if I could see the possibilities, I could control my destiny. But the more I used the clock, the more I realized that knowledge alone isn't enough. The clock shows you the paths, but it can't tell you which one to take. That's a decision only the heart can make." Clara stared at the clock, its ticking now steady and rhythmic. She thought about her life, her career, her father. For so long, she had believed that success meant solving every puzzle, finding every answer. But now she realized that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, they were meant to be lived. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have a choice, Clara. You can leave now, forget everything you've seen, and go back to the life you built, or you can embrace what the clock has shown you and use it to shape the future you want." Clara closed her eyes, her mind racing. She thought about the mirrors, the paths she had seen, the versions of herself she could become. She didn't know if she was ready to make a decision, but she knew she could stay in this liminal space forever. When she opened her eyes, She turned to Elias. What happens if I walk away? Elias smiled faintly. Then you live your life the way you always have, one moment at a time, one choice at a time, and there's nothing wrong with that. And if I stay? Clara asked. Then you carry the knowledge of what you've seen, Elias said. But knowledge can be a heavy burden. It's not an easy path, but it's a meaningful one. Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding. She reached for the dial one last time, her fingers trembling. Whatever path I choose, she said, I just want it to be mine. The room began to dissolve again, the ticking growing louder. This time, Clara didn't resist. She let the clock guide her, knowing that whatever awaited her on the other side, she was ready to face it. When the world came back into focus, Clara was standing outside Grayson's timepieces. The shop was quiet, the windows dark. She glanced down at her hands, half expecting to see the ornate key or Elias's journal, but there was nothing. She walked back to her car. She felt a strange sense of peace. The clock hadn't given her the answers she had been searching for, but it had shown her something more important, the power of choice. Every moment was a crossroads, every decision a step into the unknown, and that was okay. For the first time in years, Clara felt truly alive. Reflective epilogue, the ticking of time. Weeks had passed since Clara left the Clockmaker shop, yet the experience lingered in her mind like a faint, persistent ticking. Life in Whitestone had resumed its familiar rhythm, but for Clara, nothing felt the same. She often found herself replaying the visions the clock had shown her, the paths of ambition and connection, the choices she made and the ones she had ignored. The memories didn't haunt her as they once might have. Instead, they became a quiet reminder of life's complexity, of its beauty. Sitting on the porch of her childhood home one evening, Clara gazed at the setting of the sun. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the kind of colors that seemed to stretch time itself. Her father's old rocking chair creaked beside her, now empty. She smiled faintly, ran her fingers along the armrest. She had been afraid to come back here, afraid of confronting the emotions tied to this house and the life she had left behind. But now, she saw it differently. Not as a symbol of regret, but as a part of the web of choices that had brought her into this moment. For years, she had lived as though each decision she made had to be perfect, as though one wrong move would ruin everything. The clock had taught her otherwise. Every path had its joys and sorrows, its gains and losses. What mattered wasn't the path itself, but how she chose to walk it. Clara stood and stepped inside, her eyes scanning the walls of the living room. It was cluttered with old photographs and knickknacks, a testament to the life her father had built here. She picked up a frame from the mantel, a picture of the two of them, taken on the day they had fixed the old cash register at the hardware store. She had been so proud of their work that day, so proud of the way they laughed and celebrated afterward. I left so much behind, she thought. But even as the pain of sadness settled in her chest, she felt something else, a warmth, a recognition that those moments had shaped her. She hadn't abandoned them. They had always been with her, woven into the fabric of who she was. She set the photo down and reached for her notebook, flipping to a blank page. Her hands trembled slightly as she began to write, her thoughts spilling onto the paper like a stream finally breaking free. What I've learned, she wrote at the top of the page. The past is unchangeable, but it's also unreasonable. The future is uncertain, but that's what makes it powerful. The present is where life happens. Every choice matters, but no single choice is everything. Connection is the thread that ties it all together. Clara paused, rereading the words. They felt simple but profound, like truths she had always known but never articulated. She closed the notebook and leaned back in her chair, letting out a long, steady breath. For the first time in a long time, Clara didn't feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her. She wasn't consumed by the need to prove herself or haunted by the fear of making a mistake. She felt free.